Hello, everyone, and welcome to the January 2026 edition of the Hague Programme on International Cybersecurity's book seminar series. My name is Lisa Andersen, and I am a postdoctoral research fellow here at Leiden University in the Netherlands. Today, I'm very happy to welcome the four co-editors of the Palgrave Handbook on Cyber Diplomacy, namely George Christou, Professor of European Politics and Security at the University of Warwick in the UK, Wilhelm Vosse, Professor of Political Science and International Relations at the International Christian University in Japan, Joe Burton, Professor of Security and Protection Science at Lancaster University in the UK, and finally Joachim Koops, Professor of Security Studies at Leiden University here in the Netherlands. I'm also very happy to welcome Noelle Van der Waag-Cowling, Strategy and Innovation Officer at the Cybersecurity Institute in South Africa, who has contributed a chapter to this volume specifically on South Africa's approach to cyber diplomacy. Now, this is really an impressive piece of work. It covers a staggering 941 pages, comprises 42 chapters concentrated under 4 central themes, and deals with both theory and practice-based issues in the cyber diplomacy realm. And beyond the editors, it is the work of 64 authors. Now, in terms of what you can expect here, the next hour we'll have the authors present for about 30 to 40 minutes, and then we'll dive into Q&A. So please jot down any questions you may have for any of the speakers for then. And on that note, authors, thank you so much for joining us, and I'll hand the floor over to you. Thank you.
Hey. Thank you, Lise, and thank you for inviting us, and welcome everybody online, which is not always ideal, but thank you for to all the participants for giving up your time to listen to us today. I'm going to keep my comments very brief because I'd prefer sort of interactive Q&A. So a few thanks, first of all, well, to Lise for inviting us to actually, present here through the Hague programme in the first place, but also a few thanks to, obviously, the European Commission, because we had a project called European Cyber Diplomacy, or CyDiplo, as we call it, which really was the main vehicle for producing the handbook. We talked a little bit about the handbook before the project, and decided in our wisdom that we did need a vehicle. I think it was when Joe was a visiting fellow at Warwick back in 2018 or 19 when the conversation started, and then they progressed with both Joe and Wilhelm after that, and I'm delighted to say we ended up applying for the project, and the handbook is really one of the deliverables of that project, and we had lots of good work come out of that, workshops and a stakeholder conference that Wilhelm kindly coordinated in Tokyo, where we had an excellent turnout of cyber diplomats and academics and other stakeholders. So just a little bit of background, I guess, in terms of where we came from. And obviously a special thanks to all the authors for giving up their time, including Lise, who produced an excellent chapter on the United Nations, Noelle, who you'll hear from in a moment, but the rest of the authors as well. They really do make the book what it is in terms of excellence and diversity and knowledge and the study of cyber diplomacy. So they're sort of some opening remarks, really. So what, in terms of the handbook itself, I mean, what motivated us really? I mean, I think a few things, but a few important points, I guess. One was that this concept of cyber diplomacy began to emerge, but it was clear that it needed further problematization, further analysis in terms of its theoretical basis, and in terms of how we thought about this new sort of cyber diplomacy in practice. So, and obviously, in terms of developments as well, the internet, cyber technologies, new technologies were becoming more and more important. One could argue, a central pillar of any thinking in foreign policy in the 21st century. So those two things coupled together, I think, motivated us really to to think seriously as scholars about what it meant to say cyber diplomacy. And for that, obviously, we're thankful to some of the authors that started this work, and again, some of those authors contributed to the handbook. People like Andre Berinia, etc. I mean, there's a whole theoretical section in the handbook, and we'd urge you to have a look if you haven't. So I'll say a couple of things about some of the lessons perhaps learned, and I think the other editors can chip in as well. In terms of the different sections of the handbook, but just some general lessons. I guess, first of all, theoretically, what came out of the handbook is the importance of the range of disciplinary and ideational approaches that are really needed to understand cyber diplomacy. And this is not to say that traditional theories, state power and state action, are not important, but that actually by using other lenses, we can unearth, I guess, analyses that otherwise wouldn't be visible, so psychology, value and gender dynamics, legal dynamics, technical perspectives. So I guess the main lesson, and this is, I guess nothing particularly revolutionary, but I think it's not done enough still, is that you do need a holistic approach and a diverse theoretical base if you're going to get a more in-depth and accurate understanding of the emergence of cyber diplomacy, both academically and as a field of practice. By the way, they're not, we don't see them as detached. So, I mean, what the handbook as a product has taught us is that actually there's still a lot more work to be done, in particular in terms of the interactions between these theoretical schools of thought. We all talk about interdisciplinarity, and I think a great deal of progress has been made around interdisciplinarity, but I think there's a lot more work that needs to be done in that regard. Obviously, I'm from an international security and international relations field as well, and even within that field, in terms of thinking about cyber diplomacy, again, a lot of work has been done, but a lot more work clearly should be done within that particular field in terms of thinking about gender, law, psychology, etc., and integrating those into IR in a better way. The second element, I guess, just some general challenges that we looked at and some lessons there. First, that I guess the whole of this section 2 of the handbook addresses various challenges, and we're not saying this is an exhaustive list of challenges. This field changes on a day-to-day basis, but we tried to capture as much as possible as we could. And I think one observation is that many of the challenges obviously also bring opportunities for diplomats and cyber diplomats alike to create new ways of working to deliver and uphold cyber norms, rules, etc., through their activity. Another, I guess, perhaps lesson is to think about the tensions around what it is cyber diplomats have to protect and negotiate on. I mean, the current geopolitical environment is probably testament to that. The tension between, or the balance between ensuring human rights in cyber and actually negotiating and deliberating and finding sustainable solutions to the challenges that we face around cyberspace and new technologies are important. And I guess the final thing is that, and this is the reason why we did the handbook, is that what we've ended up with is are very complex scenarios where there are no simple answers to any of the questions that have arisen in the chapters. And this is not just in terms of the processes, but it's also questions around the actors, around the knowledge, the skills, the understanding that's required to be able to actually intervene diplomatically in issues related to cyber space. So a variety of lessons, I think, for us. Still a lot of questions left, and I'm sure the audience has also a lot of questions about who the stakeholders should be in cyber diplomacy, how they should coordinate and collaborate effectively in order to assure effective cyber diplomacy interventions, how this balance can be achieved between human rights, conflict de-escalation, prevention, and an emphasis on cyber offense and deterrence, which we often see, and finally around who cyber diplomats are. I think the chapters showed that we could frame many stakeholders as important cyber diplomats in that sense. And there are broader questions around, who they are, who will train the cyber diplomats of the future, and obviously the broader question around what does all this mean for diplomacy, in particular, again, in the current context. So the first two sections sort of try and think about and give lessons, I guess, around theory and some of the challenges and key issues. The final two sections dig deeper into the national, regional, international, and non-governmental sort of organizational approaches to cyber security. And there are lots of chapters, and I'm going to stop there because I think we're going to hear obviously from Noelle on South Africa, and then perhaps also Wilhelm can say a little bit more about sort of some of the national perspectives and lessons, and Joe maybe on the regional, international. But I will stop there because I am keen to listen also to Noelle and her thoughts on South Africa and her excellent chapter on South Africa. So I will pass on. Thank you.
Thank you, George. Lisa, I presume I'll just go ahead. So, if I may, I'll try to keep an eye on the time. So, to just start off, I think the world has changed so much since Raymond and I sat down to write this chapter 2 years ago, or 18 months ago, whatever it was. And yet, there's so many threads in that chapter that actually pull through to where we find ourselves right now. And one of the emphasis there was that one of South Africa's strengths in terms of cyber diplomacy was its commitment to multilateralism and the rules-based order. And there's something of a cautionary tale here, in the sense that South Africa has not paid enough attention to actual cyber power. South Africa has seen a dramatic exposure of its loss of hard power with a military defeat last year in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. That was its worst defeat since the fall of Tobruk in World War II. So really what we see here is, if we're starting to try and understand cyber diplomacy and its use, there's a big question that really does need to be answered as to what extent is diplomacy on its own good enough without real discernible cyber power. And I think this is where South Africa finds itself now, is the lack of an integrated government approach in general to diplomacy. We see huge contestation just over the last 2 weeks between the Department of International Cooperation, the South Africa's Department of Foreign Affairs, and the Department of Defense, who ostensibly have disobeyed an order from the Commander-in-Chief President and invited Iran to take place in a naval exercise, which happened last week, together with China and Russia. And South Africa is struggling to understand its role within BRICS, and in fact the danger of this relationship within BRICS, and what does this mean for South Africa in terms of the threats that we are creating for ourselves. Most of South Africa's attacks seem to emanate from Russia or Belarus, by the way, the ransomware attacks and things that are really costing us money and impacting us. And our inability to handle this and actually articulate it and decide, okay, really, what are we actually dealing with here between, can we separate potentially ideology, trade, and actually consequences in the cyber world. So there's really a lot going on. Since we last spoke, South Africa brought out a national interest framework, the Department of International Cooperation. And what you see in there is worryingly how inadequate it is in terms of addressing technology challenges. And last year, somebody made the point, and it was actually when the power grid on the Iberian Peninsula fell over, that the technological complexities of modern society are actually above the current abilities of most of the political classes, elected representatives. And I think it's quite an interesting statement. And certainly what we're seeing in terms of cyber power and technology challenges in South Africa, we've seen this. So, for example, South Africa last year, towards the end of the year, told Taiwan they had to uproot their trade office. They're not allowed to have an embassy in South Africa from Pretoria, where it was embedded in the diplomatic enclave, and move it to a very unsuitable, unappealing address in Johannesburg. Okay, and this was to appease its major partner in BRICS. Well, what Taiwan did and turned around and said is that's fine. We're going to cut all semiconductor chip exports to South Africa. You will have nothing. And the problem is South Africa actually manufactures a great deal of the world's cars for major companies, BMW, Mercedes-Benz, Volkswagen, Toyota, I can go on. That was devastating. So an inability to, I think, actually, when we go beyond cyber and we look at technology as a technology diplomacy combined with cyber diplomacy, there are real-world impacts from making bad decisions or not anticipating, in fact, where your dependencies lie. And added to that now, we see this absolute crumbling of the relationship between South Africa and the United States. The United States refusing to attend the G20 in South Africa last year, not even send any representative. South Africa has a massive technology dependency on the United States, on the hyperscalers. And I don't think we are sufficiently weighing up some of the risks in terms of our behavior, our statements, and the company we keep. So what we're seeing here is South Africa's done a great job at UN level, at a multilateralism level, but as the Prime Minister of Canada pointed out last week, the rules-based order, the international rules-based order is under pressure, great pressure. So South Africa does well in a formal diplomacy setting within multilateralism, an area where it's comfortable. When it comes to actually protecting its national interests, reducing dependencies, expecting friends or friendly governments not to attack it, and we don't really see any development there. In fact, I think it's fair to say South Africa is increasingly fragile as a cyber state. And I think going forward, where we would want to see a leadership role, and this is really important, is the critical access to critical minerals. Africa is endowed with a significant proportion of the world's critical minerals. This is a once-in-a-generation opportunity for African countries to actually harness this and lift themselves and their populations out of poverty, and not see another round of extractive type of activity, but actually the development of industry refinement, potentially shares in the chip making value chain, etc., happening. And I think South Africa should be looking ahead and saying, the world is changing, it's changing really quickly. We can't also just think in cyber terms, we need to think in technology terms, in terms of quantum, AI, and cybersecurity, and take our leadership role in Africa again and make sure that we drive home the deal of a lifetime here and lift ourselves and our people out of poverty. And so we need to have a far broader focus from this point of view as an African country. And I think we're thinking too small and we're very fixated on aspects of cyber diplomacy, but really this needs to be woven in with our economic future and with our national security future. And I think I'll stop it there. I've spoken probably for quite a while. And so thank you for that and for the opportunity to contribute the chapter.
Fantastic, thank you. I mean, we still have time left if any of the other editors would like to intervene. Wilhelm, did you want to offer any thoughts?
Yes, I could offer a few more words on the breadth of the countries that we represent or are represented in this handbook. And I'm happy to see that Greg Austin is among us as well, who wrote the chapter on Australia. So George already talked about the theoretical aspects and the different domains that cyber diplomacy has affected or that are affected by cyber diplomacy itself. And Noelle just gave a very good introduction or overview of some of the challenges of a specific country outside of Europe, South Africa in this case. I think what is one of the outstanding maybe features of this handbook that is not always the case in edited volumes is that we gave all the authors a very specific list of questions. And the handbook has 17 chapters on individual countries, on a wide range of different countries. And we ask all these authors basically to talk about the specific challenges that these countries have. Nuala just talked about some of the challenges that a country like South Africa have, the institutional setup of these countries, the central policies, how the state actually exercises and conducts cyber diplomacy, and what the future of cyber diplomacy is. And the handbook, again, ranges the number of countries, obviously, in Europe, in North America, obviously, like the United States and China, Japan, Singapore, Australia, and a number of other countries. And I think one of the lessons or one of the things that the handbook can provide is that we can see that other countries are challenged in slightly different ways, which of course depends on where you are, how powerful you are in the global system itself, and who your neighbors are. And so when you're a country like South Korea, for example, or Japan in a similar way, then threats and cyber threats from North Korea, for example, are a specific concern for you. Uh, South Korea, of course, has an advanced digital infrastructure similar to Japan. So there's a lot of room or attack vectors that, of course, you need to protect. And then we have chapters on countries on the Pacific Islands, for example, that are still undergoing a rapid digital transformation and require improvements. So there are still certain remnants that I think we kind of seem to have already gone beyond in Europe and North America, which was long called the so-called digital divide, so that the pure infrastructure itself needs or is in need of an upgrade. And so in third challenge in many countries, therefore, is this digital divide or the development of digital skills and infrastructure. And then we ask, as I said before, questions on cyber diplomatic capacities and the institutional setup, which is also quite different in many countries. So we have seen an evolution here. Many countries nowadays in Europe, in North America, in Australia, or in East Asia, like Japan and South Korea or Singapore, they have specific units within the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, for example. An increasing number of countries have actually dedicated cyber diplomats. Not all countries, and they're called differently. They have different offices, and they're in different institutional setups. But that's one of the interesting, I think, aspects of this handbook that one can see how different the institutionalization is. The institutionalization of cyber diplomacy is further evidenced by national cybersecurity strategies that many countries have issued in recent years. More and more countries have, as I said, specific cyber diplomats who are specifically in charge of this. But again, in some cases, they are replaced on a regular basis. So there is a problem of institutional memory sometimes and expertise. Not all these cyber diplomats necessarily have a domain knowledge or background in technology more broadly or cybersecurity more broadly. They are shifted around quite often. When we look at major policies or strategies, then of course all democracies or democratic countries usually prioritize responsible state behavior in cyberspace to maintain peace and security, establishing norms, behavior, confidence building. And of course, those of us who are in cyber diplomacy and cyberspace are quite aware of this. But of course, the handbook is also, I hoped at least, important for those who are not necessarily expert on cyber at all, but are interested in diplomacy and a new or still developing domain in diplomacy, and would like to see how this has been established and how it is changing, and how the institutional setup works. Um, Cooperation, obviously, in international settings, in UN settings, but there are also a large number now of bilateral, trilateral, regional, whether it's ASEAN, whether it's in Europe, whether it's in Africa, of course, or in Latin America, where cyber diplomacy, of course, is a core issue of debate. Improving cyber capacity to assist other nations. Capacity building is, of course, another major domain here. And the fourth central strategy is engagement, international forums, as I said. So there are also different ways of how cyber diplomacy influences cyber-related matters. So the United States, the UK, China are oftentimes seen as global leaders with different objectives that come from a different perspective. China, obviously, more in the having a vision of a so-called cyber sovereignty and a state control of the IT systems in cyberspace. Japan fosters more international cooperation, again, in a large number of networks. Japan might not often come up when you're not have a specific interest in East Asia, but whether it's an ASEAN or G7 declaration of responsible state behavior in cyberspace, the Ise-Shima principles, and so on and so forth. Of course, it's collaborating with other countries is not the only one. And then strategic alignments, of course, in the region itself, your security partners, trading partners in the region, of course, for Japan, that is countries in ASEAN, and some of those, of course, are lacking as far as security is concerned. And then the question was about, well, how effective is cyber diplomacy in itself? And again, there's a whole range of different aspects, how it has changed. So a country like the United Kingdom obviously focuses or has included now, just like the United States, more offensive or at least active cyber defense capabilities, while at the same time sponsoring responsible cyber powers for a comprehensive and integrated approach to cybersecurity, influencing global discussions. Others, like the EU, have issued like cyber diplomatic toolboxes, a whole set of tools that other countries can potentially use and copy and use for themselves. And then finally, as a final word coming to an end here is, what the future of cyber diplomacy. In some countries, chapter highlights the clear ambition of future challenges for cyber diplomacy. Again, whether it's the UK or Germany integrated in the European attribution, for example, on cyber conflicts, how can we attribute that? Do we publicly attribute cyber incidences? Denmark advances a strategic objective, being the leading voice of promoting secure, reliable, prosperous, open cyberspace. And Singapore is, for example, in a very unique position, so to say, as an ASEAN member state, a country obviously in Southeast Asia, but which is highly developed, especially in terms of its technological development and in cyberspace as an actor in cyber diplomacy itself. So I think in a nutshell, what a handbook like this can offer is to show the breadth and the differences that different countries are in and how they respond, how they institutionalize cyber diplomacy, and where their future development or where they see the future of cyber diplomacy. So there's still a range of different developments. So I stop this here and give it back maybe to Lise or George. Thank you.
Thank you very much. George, do you have more you'd like to say, or shall we go into Q&A?
Yeah, let's go into Q&A, I think.